could you briefly tell us about the work that you did in Greater Manchester, who you brought together and what they actually produced using this method of legislative theatre?
Sure. So this example of the Greater Manchester Homelessness Prevention Strategy took place really through 2020 and 2021. So the strategy is now in place and being enacted, and I'll talk a little bit about the sort of impacts and outcomes at the end. But the history of that is that Greater Manchester has a mandate from the Mayor, Andy Burnham, to end homelessness, and an intersector network called the Greater Manchester Homelessness Action Network that was brought together by Andy Burnham. And their first goal was to sort of create emergency response, and they did that in 2018, 2019. And then they needed to work on prevention. But at the same time, they were getting a lot of critique about the way they were or were not doing co-production with people directly impacted by homelessness to create those strategies and implement those actions. So that was the initiative and the intention for engaging legislative theater as a tool. And so it was really a 1.5 year long project, which is now ongoing in the sort of outcomes, in which 35 people directly impacted by homelessness came together to create 3 different plays about 3 different issues that had already been identified by the Greater Manchester Combined Authority. And this was funded by the Greater Manchester Combined Authority, right? So commissioned by them in order to create their prevention strategy. The 3 issues were topics that had already been identified as key challenges in prevention. So these were multiple disadvantage, right? So intersecting challenges that people face and the way that those are sort of siloed in terms of support often, and then funding and commissioning cycles as a problem in itself, and structural racism in relation to homelessness and other social services in Greater Manchester. So those were the 3 issue areas. And the first thing that we did is actually invite people with experience of homelessness who are interested in facilitation to do 12 weeks of facilitation training. So the whole project was co-facilitated by a group of 5 people with experience of homelessness who met for 12 weeks. And then starting in July 2021, we met with the first group of about 8 people who were directly impacted by multiple disadvantage. So this might be mental health challenges and housing challenges and substance use challenges, right? Or something along those lines. And they came together to play games that started to bring up conversations about shared experiences. And the idea here with legislative theater is sort of what is the relationship between my daily lived experience of challenge in getting what I need and the policies that exist or don't exist already in this locality, right? So for example, a story in that first play about multiple disadvantages, someone coming to the DWP called in with a job offer, and the job is in construction, and they've already lost 6 jobs in construction within several weeks because of the impact on their mental health. But the DWP says, if you return down this job that we offer you, you're going to get sanctioned. And so this person does get sanctioned, right? And all these stories are coming from people's real life experiences. And then that impacts on his ability to pay for his housing, obviously, right? Or another father who's not considered the primary caregiver and therefore is not offered any kind of housing where his children who are supposed to be visiting with him every week are able to see him. So he's asking for other kinds of housing and there's no kind of support and for that, right? So these are some of the daily lived experiences that we wanted to bring up in terms of what are the policy problems or the policies in place that are causing these problems, or what are the opportunities for policy change? And we did that on each of the 3 issues. So meeting for 6 to 8 weeks, everybody in the project got paid. That's really crucial. This is work, advocacy for everyone. And then culminating, and I know you're going to ask me about this in a second, in a live performance. And we did this during COVID, so the actors were in person in this case, and the audience was on Zoom live streaming and interacting with us. But that's the idea, that games and exercises in a collaborative, fun, joyful, accessible process lead people to do participatory research and collective problem identification in terms of the policy cycle, and represent those problems in a play that they then took to stakeholders, staff, policymakers in a legislative theater event. So I'll pause there for a second.
Thanks, Katie. That sounds really exciting. And my understanding is that as well as the participants kind of being able to articulate what their concerns are, or their aspirations are, the audience also got to play a role in shaping policy. So how did you bring the audience into that?
Yeah, so that's the crucial element of legislative theater. So part of it is the community organizing, the community building, the problem identification, as we said. And then we come to the event. And so the event needs to be a really diverse mix of stakeholders. We usually say it should be at least 50% people who are directly impacted by the problem, as well as people who are impacted in other ways, like working in social services, working in frontline services, being policy makers, right? And we make sure we have a key group of policy makers who have decision-making power on that issue in the event. Sometimes I call them, to myself, policy rangers, like Power Rangers, who have lots of different powers against a problem, right? So those might be lawyers, they might be council administration, they might be counselors, right? We need different levels. They might be MPs, we need different levels of power. And then we perform the play, and we have a dialogue about the problem. So we analyze the problems collectively. What problems did you see? How are they relating to problems you're seeing in your life, in your work, et cetera? And then we let the audience say, what resources or rules or practices would you like to see implemented in these situations in order to move closer to the human rights that we need, right? The civil rights that we need, the experience that people are identifying as, in this case, barrier to preventing homelessness or recurring homelessness, right? So that we're always looking at our policy question and coming back to the platform that we're trying to inform. And so people get to chat with each other, think for a few minutes, what would I try? Ooh, I want an advocate here. I think there should be more people with lived experience of homelessness working in the DWP. I think, right, what's the resources that we want to try? And then we ask those people, and in this case, we did this in a live stream setting. So with a projector, the audience are looking, we were the actors looking at the audience on a projector screen, and the audience is on Zoom, but usually this is happening in real life. We invite the audience members who become, in this case, spect-actors, so people who watch and take action, not just spectators, to come in, try their idea in the scene as one of the characters. So replace a character, right? Test their idea, and the actors are prepared through their rehearsal to push back on their idea. So this is actually real world policy testing to find the holes in this theory of change, right? In order to push those audience members to become more radical and for the ideas to be more practically relevant to the problem. And we do that 3 or 4 or 5 times, and we get lots of ideas in relation to lots of problems, right? How we're going to change the computer system, how we're going to change the staff training, how we're going to change the staff makeup, how we're going to change the timeline of, eliminating sanctions altogether, et cetera, whatever it is. But after each idea, we have a further discussion and analysis. So, this would only work if we got these people on board. This would only work if we could change this national legislation. This would only, right? What else do we need to know? And we ask the audience about that, and we ask the actors about that. And then finally, everyone is invited to turn those interventions, those tested ideas or alternatives, into policy proposals. So they actually write them down. This is what I would like to see. Everybody, policymakers, not policymakers, actors, everyone is a policymaker in this process. And we might end up with 100 policy ideas or 40 policy ideas, or depending on how many people are there. And then our policy rangers, right? So in this case, like the strategic lead of homelessness for the GMCA and the elected members and this and that, help us process those 30 or 40 or 50 ideas into 3 or 4 based on popularity, practicality, like narrowing them down and just sort of processing them in real time in front of all of us. And then we have a further debate, make amendments, additions, what's missing, who's left out of this policy, have a vote on priorities. And finally, and I'll stop talking again, there's commitments. This is the very key to me and most exciting almost part of the process, is that all of those policy rangers or policymaker team have to make a commitment, at least one commitment to action for what they're going to do in the next 4 to 8 weeks, a timeline that whatever timeline we've already agreed to move those things forward. And in the case of the GMCA homelessness prevention strategy, we actually knew that the strategy was going to come out later in 2021. So one of the commitments was that they had already committed at the front end that we're going to see all the proposals that came out of these 3 events. And overall, there were 23 audience debated proposals. I mean, out of hundreds, we had narrowed it down, 23. We're going to see which ones are in the strategy, and you're going to mark them as this came out of the community generated legislative theater process. And actually, leading into maybe your last question, all 23 of those are in the strategy at this point.
That is fantastic. And it's great to see that an exciting and an innovative approach also has that kind of practical outcome at the end and serious commitments from policymakers. That was one of the questions that's come through on the chat. It'd be great, Katie, if you could share a little bit from your perspective of why using this approach is beneficial compared to maybe more traditional tools of consultation. There are lots of opportunities for councils to talk to people, and there are some tools that perhaps we lean on more than others, and sometimes sort of unknowingly kind of just go with. So to do this sort of thing would take somebody with a little bit of courage, perhaps, or with a determination to reject the status quo and try something very different. So could you explain maybe the benefits of doing that? And then there's also a question in the chat about facilitation, and basically, if you don't have somebody in the council who is a practitioner of this, like, is it possible to get people from outside to help?
Yeah. So I see also questions in the chat, and Tom, maybe you'll say, but I shared with Tom some links of lots of information and write-ups on this. There's videos, there's an independent evaluation, there's the strategy, which documents the process. And this project also in December last year won the International Observatory on Participatory Democracy Award for Best Practice in Citizen Participation. So we were in Grenoble with the GMCA and people with experience of homelessness who've been part of the project. And what they were talking about, and to your question about what I think are the benefits of this. So a couple things. First of all, and as I heard you all talking about coming back from the break, there's identifying and framing the policy problem from the experience of the people who are impacted by it. And I personally think, and the ethics of this, kind of the politics of legislative theater, say that we can't really fix a policy problem until we've identified exactly how it is impacting people who are living with that problem. And I think too often that doesn't happen first. And so you'll see in some of the evaluation materials from this project and other projects that's something that the policymakers talked about a lot, is actually a different understanding of the problem, right, from this framing. But that's not all, right? So then the idea is that we're creating a fun and creative environment, and I take fun very seriously, because I think to some of these points and some of the things you all were talking about before, right? There's often a lot of tension. There's either a lack of engagement, right? Because I feel like the council's not listening, or there isn't even a pathway to listen, right, to get my voice heard. Or when we have these sort of town halls, in my experience and in the councils that I work with experience, there can be a lot of tension. It can be there's a lot of frustration. A lot of things aren't working. So how do we bring, right, and somebody was talking about trust building, how do we bring the different stakeholders together, right? And I think this is actually somewhat a missing piece. And I work a lot with other participatory democracy strategies like participatory budgeting and citizens assemblies. And we're working also around the UK and around the world to integrate things like legislative theater into those. But sometimes what's missing from those is deep relationship building between policymakers and community members, right? And this has the opportunity to create that fun, creative environment. We're laughing, we're playing games, we're building a scene together. So in some of the other projects that I've worked on recently with councils, including Coventry City Council and Haringey Council in London, we were working towards their rough sleeping strategies in both cases. And in those processes, for the first time that I've done this, half of the actors were frontline council staff and half were people with experience of homelessness. So we were actually identifying the problem from both perspectives. What are the problems that frontline council staff are having, and what are the problems that people with experience of homelessness are having in preventing rough sleeping in those boroughs or in those councils? So just the benefits, right? Problem identification, fun, creative environment, testing, actual real world testing of policy, right, ideas, and then getting those commitments. And in all of these cases, including in the GMCA project, building a team, a network of people who are so engaged in the policymaking that you create an environment and a structure for them to continue to engage in the negotiation and implementation along the way. So here in the GMCA, like one of the ideas was that there should be lived experience led trauma informed training for councils, and now a bunch of the actors from that project are developing that with funding, right? So that's one of the ongoing impacts. And I'll stop there for a second, but just to say, this is going on in lots of different councils. You do kind of need some external facilitation, right? So I've been working with Glasgow City Council, Medway Council's doing a strategy soon using legislative theatre in Kent. Glasgow is working with disabled young people about their climate policy, specifically about transport and green spaces and accessibility, right? Right now we're working on youth mental health policies with the Greater Manchester NHS Trust and the GM Police, talking about police responses to mental health crises. So there's lots of ways to apply this. And I think just to your last point about courage, that's something that the GMCA talks about a lot, that this does take courage to do something really differently and to open up to critique. But I think as the GMCA, you know, our partners talk about, they're getting critique anyways. So how about get critique in a really constructive and even joyful and inclusive context that can lead to actionable commitments?
Thank you so much, Katie. So there's so much that we have learned from that process and the experience in Greater Manchester and around the world. And again, this is just one of many examples that our research has shown of people that are taking, you know, courageous and brave steps to try things a bit different in order to maximize the engagement and increase the quality of policy that is produced and outcomes for people. So thank you so much, Katie, for sharing your story.